I will have the disaster.
Это тоже часть общества.
En kalbi duygularımla
Kusurlarımız, hatalarımız olursa affola. Elçiye zeval olmaz. Elçiye zeval olmazdan herkese selamlar. Başkan Obama'nın ikinci döneminden beri Amerika'nın tedrici olarak Ortadoğu'dan geri çekilmesini ve büyük güç rekabetine öncelik verme perspektifini konuşuyoruz. Amerika'nın Ortadoğu ve Körfez ülkelerinin güvenliğine giderek daha az yatırım yapması sonucu bölge ülkeleri de Amerika'nın rakipleriyle de ilişkilerini geliştirdiler ve Amerika'dan daha bağımsız bir politika izlediler. Ortadoğu konusunda Trump'ın ilk başkanlık dönemine damga vuran gelişme İbrahim Anlaşmaları ve bazı Arap ülkelerinin İsrail ile ilişkilerini normalleştirmesiydi. Trump ikinci döneminde de ilk resmi ziyaretini yine Orta Doğu'ya ve Körfez ülkelerine yaptı. Ancak bu sefer İsrail'e es geçti. Baktığınız zaman bir yanda Gazze konusunda İsrail'e yeşil ışık yakan ama bir diğer yandan da Körfez'deki müttefiklerinin de istekleri doğrultusunda İran'la nükleer anlaşma görüşmelerine devam eden, Suriye yeni hükümetini tanıyıp yaptırımları kaldıran ve Hamas'la aracısız görüşen bir Amerikan hükümetiyle karşı karşıyayız. Öyle görünüyor ki Amerika'nın Make America Great Again yani MAGA politikası Orta Doğu için de geçerli. Bugün Amerika'nın Orta Doğu politikasını Başkan Trump'ın son Körfez turu ışığında ele alacağız. Amerika'nın önde gelen Orta Doğu uzmanlarından biriyle beraberiz. Bilal Saab halen Abu Dhabi merkezli araştırma ve danışmanlık kuruluşu Trend'in Amerika Ofisi'nin kıdemli genel direktörü. Saab bundan önce birçok think tank'te araştırmacı ve yönetici olarak da görev yapmış bir isim. Aynı zamanda Georgetown Üniversitesi'nde Amerika'nın Orta Doğu savunma politikaları ve uluslararası güvenlik çalışmaları üzerine uzun yıllarda ders verdi. Aynı zamanda Amerika'nın Orta Doğu savunması işbirliği konusunda yayınladığı kitabı da ödül aldı. Daha önce de Pentagon'da Savunma Politikaları Müsteşarlığı Ofisi'nde Güvenlik İşbirliği Kıdemli Danışmanı olarak görev yaptı ve Amerikan Merkez Komutanlığı'ndan yani CENTCOM'dan sorumlu denetim görevlerini üstlendi. Anlayacağınız, konuşacağımız kişi bu konuları çok yakından ve içeriden bilen bir isim. O yüzden bu özel röportajı kaçırmayın derim ve YouTube kanalıma abone olmayı unutmayın. Hadi o zaman başlayalım. Hi Bilal, thank you for
Hello.
joining the Messenger.
My pleasure.
So I would like to start with a general question regarding the U.S. Middle East policy. For over a decade, we are talking about the U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East. And in light of this, how should we interpret President Trump's recent tour of the Gulf region? Does the Middle East still remain a strategic priority for the U.S., or is the relationship now increasingly defined by economic considerations?
Okay. We're starting with a heavy hitter. So let's try to unpack it a little bit. But before I do that, Pinar, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for hosting me. I really appreciate it. Look, I'll be perfectly candid. I never bought the notion or the idea that the United States has withdrawn from the Middle East. I know we've been talking about it, gosh, at least for the past 3 administrations. Okay, a lot of chatter about this. But if you were to once again unpack that assumption and really try to come up with some definitive evidence, at least militarily speaking, okay, which is my field, there is very thin, very little evidence to really support that claim. I mean, we virtually have the same posture across the region, minus some minimal cuts here and there of like training missions in Jordan, maybe in Iraq as well, Syria. You probably want to talk about Syria later. But overall, I have yet to see a strategic reassessment of our presence slash posture in the Middle East. So we could talk about it all we want. And I know that we have the desire to further withdraw assets, but in practice, in real life, I have yet to see it, to be honest. Now, you talk about the Trump administration, you might see some changes here and there to accelerate those cuts, the trimming effort of the posture, but I really don't expect anything drastic. Is the Middle East still a strategic priority? I really think so, still, always has been. And what the president is doing now, frankly, is quite pragmatic and clever, which is to really leverage that one instrument of national power of the Arab partners that is now having an effect on the international economy, global commerce, and even international stability more than anything else, which is wealth. Okay, they're sovereign wealth funds that can fund emerging technologies that are incredibly important in today's day and age. So he's right to emphasize that. He's right to realign U.S. interests with those of the Arab partners on the basis of how can they work together and developing, ideally jointly, those emerging technologies that are just absolutely critical for the 21st century and beyond. He's quite blunt about his approach in terms of America first, okay? And he's quite transactional about it. I don't think it's brand new what he's doing. The United States has always been America first, but his version of it is a little bit more aggressive. It's a little bit more blunt, and really he has no qualms about communicating what he's doing. And it's about time that we actually take him seriously about, his America first approach. So yes, the Middle East still matters a great deal, despite all the rhetoric that you're seeing from Washington about, the reduced strategic significance of the region. Absolutely not.
Great, thank you. I would like to focus now on U.S. regional integration plans. So during his Middle East tour, Trump did not stop by Israel. And would you agree, as some experts argue, that the Trump administration is distancing itself from Israel? Is the expansion of the Abraham Accords, possibly including Syria and Saudi Arabia, still a key goal for the U.S.?
Yeah, another great question. Listen, I've been thinking about this for some time, and I've actually made an effort over the past few weeks to meet with some folks in Washington who, without naming names, who play really influential key roles in what we call here the pro-Israel community. Okay, and I'm not going to lie to you, they're quite nervous. They're nervous about this administration because they feel like they need to reimagine and reassess how they can influence policy in the administration and to some extent in Congress, although they still have more weight in Congress. But in this administration, they feel like all the levers that they've used in the past either no longer work or are less effective today. And that's because of one reason and one reason only, which is the President of the United States himself. President Trump, I don't think to answer your question, I don't think he's distancing the United States from Israel. I think he's just quite annoyed with the Israeli prime minister. I mean, there's a distinction here, right? And he's politically savvy enough to balance between the two. I don't think he's going to pick a fight with the pro-Israel community in the United States because it is still a very influential community that has a broad base that actually goes beyond the Jewish community in the United States, that has a lot of Christians as well, okay? And that has influence in both parties, in the Republican Party and also in the Democratic Party. So this is not a fight Trump wants to pick at home, okay? That said, and I think it's important for me to communicate that to you, Pinar. That said, I can't think of another president in the history of the United States, maybe to some extent Eisenhower, okay, who has more range in foreign policy and greater latitude in foreign policy than President Trump. And that includes Israel. Because of his broad-based popular support, let's call it the MAGA crowd, okay? Because of that broad base, he has the ability to operate in foreign policy in ways way more independent than any other president, okay? There are limits, as always. But you're seeing some examples of that on the Israel issue. And you mentioned one that is quite critical, right? Not going to Israel, the way he communicates with the Israeli prime minister, his approach with regard to Iran, if you want to talk about that later, his emphasis on expanding the Abraham Accords, all of these things in principle, strategically, are actually for the benefit of Israel, but not necessarily beneficial to this Israeli government, right? That's the distinction. And I think President Trump is savvy enough politically to try to balance between the two and not, lose or damage relations with such a key historical, long-standing partner of the United States in the Middle East. Also, the latest personnel adjustments in the administration, right? The loss of some folks who were quite, lack of a better word, hawkish, neoconservative, pro-Israel, And there's a much smaller bench of those now in the administration. So I'll leave you with that thought, that I don't think the United States as a whole, under the leadership of President Trump, is distancing itself from Israel. I think Israel is still getting the same kind of treatment. But boy, is he losing patience with the Israeli prime minister, right? And then how that's going to play out over the next few months, perhaps even weeks, is going to be quite fascinating, especially as we move forward with negotiations on the Iran issue. The overall support for the state of Israel remains the same. But there are going to be some limits to that, because his priority is, once again, to expand the Abraham Accords and to personally get a Nobel Peace Prize, right? And if the Israeli prime minister is the one blocking those things, something's got to give.
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's move on to the US policy on Iran now. So do you believe the current negotiations on a nuclear deal with Iran would succeed? And if so, which regional partners do you think the US will rely on to balance Iran's influence once the deal is accomplished?
Well, it depends on what you mean by succeed, right? I mean, the Iranians have their own definition, the Americans have their own definition, and the Arab partners have their own definition, right? So let's just start with where we are, because before you and I started talking, I mean, just yesterday, there was a good bit of important news that came out, describing where we are in the negotiations. But let's just sum it up very quickly. The last thing we heard was that Steve Witkoff, the special envoy for the Middle East, who Trump personally appointed, sent out a proposal to the Iranians saying, we can't accept that you enrich uranium on your soil. We will recognize your right, which is different, but you can't exercise it. And then the Iranians said, no chance, non-starter. We're not going to give up a nuclear program that we paid billions to construct, right? The alternative idea, which was floated, I think, by the Omanis, who are sort of serving as a mediator, is that, all right, how about we just create a regional consortium, right? We don't know where it would be. I don't know what the location would that would be, but it's kind of like a pie in the sky. It's like an alternative idea where different countries in the region would enrich uranium at very low levels, obviously, not bomb grade. And I'm not sure how serious the administration is about that idea. They seem to be sort of sympathetic to it. We haven't heard from the Iranians about that. I'm not sure that they're going to be in agreement with that. But even if it were to be a viable alternative, I mean, there are huge question marks about it. Not just the location, but like, what are the verification mechanisms? What if there's cheating? What are the enforcement mechanisms? All of those things, right? And maybe I'm the only one who's confused, but I thought that the US position was no enrichment whatsoever. And the latest ideas that were floated was, no, you can sort of enrich, but at very low levels, or you could keep what you have, but suspend all further Iranian nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment. And so I don't know where we're going to go from here. It's almost like a 0-1 proposition. It's almost like in absolute terms. There is no wiggle room, apparently, allegedly, between the two sides. I don't know how they're going to find a formula where there's some kind of a middle ground, okay? What could change the status quo, drastically change it, is obviously the threat of a military attack against the Iranians. Whether that's triggered by the Israelis or jointly with the Americans, I don't know, but the president was quite clear that, if you don't take this deal, then the threat of the use of force dramatically increases. It's kind of like sign or get bombed, right? I don't know how close or far we are from that. You got to remember that this is also a president who came to office in the first administration and now in his second administration being quite clear about ending wars in the Middle East. And the Iranians know that very well. And they're sort of using that to their advantage. Now, there's a limit to that because he's kind of an unpredictable president, right? So you don't know how, serious he is about ending all wars and not starting new ones. We don't understand really how critical this whole Iran issue is for the president, right? But at this very juncture, as you and I are talking right now, we seem to be at an impasse. where the Iranians are insisting on something and the Americans are insisting on something completely, opposite to it. So that tells you that there's going to be more rounds, there's going to be more negotiations, and boy, who is clearly in favor of kicking the can down the road and buying time? The Iranians, of course. Why? Because if they can continue to do that, and oh, by the way, continue to enrich at higher levels, because the IAEA came up with a report just what is it, like Saturday, saying that they now have something around 900 pounds of 60% level enriched uranium, which is very easy to convert to 90%, which is when you make a weapon, right? Now, I'm not talking about, how do you put that on a delivery system and you actually make it a deployable weapon. That might take a year or so. But to move from 60 to 90 is incredibly a short period of time, and it's much more manageable for the Iranians. And they're also looking at the 2026 midterm elections. I mean, if the president is weaker here domestically and the Democrats gain ground, then maybe his hand in foreign policy is also weakened, and therefore he might be making more concessions with the Iranians or anybody else. I don't know. But if there's one thing the Iranians want to do is kick the can down the road and continue to develop their nuclear program to enhance their bargaining power.
What is the Gulf partners' stance on a military attack on Iran? Did they present their opinion to President Trump during his trip?
The Gulf partners? Oh, I mean, you can imagine that they're clearly against something like that. I mean, this is like going after a beehive, stirring it just enough, but not killing the bees, right? Or a hornet's nest, whatever expression you want to use. And they were on the receiving end of, Iranian attacks. Let's start with the infamous example of September 2019, when the Iranians attacked Saudi Aramco. That's the last thing they want, right? Their number one priority right now is economic development, modernization, diversification. They want peace and quiet in the region. The last thing they want is a shooting war between the Americans and the Iranians, where they are actually being attacked, and the Americans are much more, able to defend themselves. I think there's been clear communication to the Trump administration, to the previous administration, to the Israelis, everybody they can talk to, that, good God, avoid a war with Iran. That's the last thing you want to sign up to. And of course, that they've done everything they can to sign, normalization agreements with the Iranians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, all of that, to try to sort of lower the temperature as much as possible in the region.
Absolutely. And also bases are in the Middle East anyway, the US will need to use. So now I would like to ask you a question.
Yeah, it's a great point, Dinar, right?
Yeah,
not only did they communicate their interest in avoiding a war, but they've actually also told the Americans that any strikes going after even the Houthis, right? Or anybody in Iraq, you can't use your bases on our territory. But if you want to go to Afghanistan, shoot somebody there, that's fine.
Okay, great point. Thank you.
Yeah.
So now I would like to ask you a question about Syria. We see a big shift on US policy on Syria. And during his Gulf trip, Trump lifted US sanctions on Syria and met with interim President al-Shara. He also has been speaking positively about Turkey and President Erdogan, who joined by phone the meeting between al-Shara, Trump, and Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman. In light of these developments, when do you foresee a US withdrawal from Syria, and what trajectory do you expect for American policy regarding the SDF-YPG, but also the fight against ISIS?
Wow, you're really coming out with some tough questions. So I don't know when we're going to withdraw from Syria, but the writing is on the wall. There have been all sorts of signs from even the first Trump administration saying that the United States was going to withdraw all, troops from the country. There's been a lot of resistance. I can tell you that. I know that for a fact from CENTCOM, from military commanders. But what do we have now? Like 2,000? So down to 1,400. CENTCOM is saying if you're going to further trim, at least keep 500 troops so that we can sort of check ISIS and stay in that box and make sure that those prisons where the, God knows how many do we have, like 9,000, 10,000 ISIS fighters with their families, so that we can keep that, as contained as possible. I don't know when we're going to see a decision by the Trump administration, but I can tell you that folks, what we're going to call the interagency, okay, including the Pentagon with CENTCOM, but also in the State Department, who are going to fight that decision. I don't know how successful they're going to be. I don't know how effective they're going to be, because this is the president who, I mean, let alone that it's Trump with his style, which is incredibly, forceful, authoritative. But even if it weren't Trump, when the president of the United States issues an order, the entire executive branch has to follow, obviously, no matter what. Joel Rayburn is about to be confirmed in the State Department. I know he has a strong interest in the Syria file. I know that he believes that we should have some presence in Syria. Okay. But I don't know how effective he's going to be to communicate that preference throughout the interagency and to the National Security Council, which, by the way, the National Security Council right now, I'm not even sure who's working on the Middle East right now, beyond Steve Witkoff, but the entire institution has been gutted, right? To 1/3 of it, though, what it was, rightly or wrongly, we can have that conversation later. Okay. But the bottom line is that the personnel working on the Middle East in the National Security Council right now just are either very few or don't exist. We used to have a senior director. He's not there anymore. Okay. All I want to say about this issue, Pinar, is that if you are going to make a decision to withdraw all troops, then I, good God, pray that you've already made a strategic, serious assessment of the consequences of that withdrawal. Don't make that purely based on political calculations, right? And I understand that the politics are too strong. I mean, this is once again a president who said, we don't want to be entangled in wars. We don't want to have troops overseas that, we're paying for to keep there and all that. I mean, this is incredibly sexy, attractive to the MAGA crowd, okay? They want to see those troops gone yesterday. But I pray to God that you don't make that decision just based on domestic political calculations, and that there's some kind of a strategic assessment of why you made that. And there is you mentioned them yourself. There are changes in Syria that might make such a withdrawal a bit more manageable, right? You've got a new leadership. You've got a very important agreement between the SDF and this new government to merge. So there is a bit more firepower in Syria, local, that could fight ISIS, or that could keep it in check, or that could play a role of a policing role, in addition maybe to some, special operators from the United States, but not, the 1,400 or 2,000 or whatever it is. So the conditions today permit some kind of a further troop reduction, if not withdrawal. Although I promise you that in Washington, there's a huge debate. I'm not privy to it. I'm not your Syria expert, okay? So I hope that you can speak to others who are more authoritative and informed about Syria. But I promise you that there are people in this town who are incredibly against any kind of troop withdrawal from Syria because of the consequences regarding counterterrorism and stability in Syria. And this is a fragile new government. They need help. It's not enough that they have agreed with the SDF and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know when that withdrawal is going to happen, but all signs indicate that it's a matter of when, not if.
I would like to now ask a specific question on Turkey, given your past role.
I knew you were going to ask me about Turkey.
Can I?
Yeah, sure. But I'm not your Turkey expert, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, but still, well, the Pentagon. So, although under EUCOM's jurisdiction, Turkey plays a key role in the Middle East, but had a difficult relationship in the past with CENTCOM. So, if the SDF is no longer a factor, do you think this opens the door for stronger U.S.-Turkish military cooperation in the region?
Okay. Well, let me start with an insight that is a little bit broader. Okay. I hope I'm not mistaken, that the claim that U.S.-Turkish relations are incredibly strained at a very low point right now, and there might be even a rupture in relations, has always been overblown. I still believe that Turkey, by virtue of being a NATO ally, is incredibly important to U.S. strategic calculations, not just in the Middle East, but more broadly. And frankly, in large part, this relationship has remained so important because of personnel in the United States who understand how important this relationship is, including the former U.S. ambassador in Turkey, who did a fantastic job maintaining that relationship. I don't see the need to move Turkey to CENTCOM. They could perfectly stay within EUCOM. That's not the issue. Okay, even though I know that there's some voices in Washington who are very eager to move Turkey from the European desk in the State Department, right, to Near East. Because why not? I mean, this is a Middle Eastern power. It has a ton of influence, a big role, large responsibilities in the Middle East. Why not put them in the Near East Bureau? Okay, whatever. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me a whole lot more is what kind of a relationship do we have with Turkey, okay? Everything else becomes, technicalities, bureaucracy. Oh, we need to change the unified command plan of CENTCOM, just like we did for Israel. Remember when we moved Israel from EUCOM to CENTCOM? I don't think we need those tools to upgrade, enhance military coordination with the Turks. I think by virtue of them being in NATO, we have plenty of consultative mechanisms. We have plenty of tools. We have plenty of means to work with the Turks on military coordination in ways like no other partner in the Middle East enjoys. Why? Because there's not a single treaty ally of the United States in the Middle East that has what Turkey has with us, okay? So it comes down to political will more than anything else. It's not about, once again, tools, measures, mechanisms, institutions. We have all of these things within NATO. It's more about the politics. It's more about political willingness. Let me remind you, just 2 years ago, Pinar, the Turks and the Americans had one of the largest military drills that they've had, in more than like 7 years before that, okay? People don't recognize those things, but they're incredibly important. Okay, we need Turkey not just for Middle East stability. We need Turkey to actually secure the Black Sea. We need Turkey because it has a fantastic navy. We need Turkey because it has an oversized role now in Syria, right? And so, and of course, it's getting much closer to the Gulf states with the Qataris as well. I don't think we have an option of really degrading relations with the Turks. I think this whole notion that the relationship has reached its lowest point, maybe we should treat the Turks as a pariah. Maybe we should, be as pragmatic with the Turks as possible and even expel them from NATO. All of that is nonsense. It's so overblown. And the smart people in this town understand that. The smart people in this town understand how Turkey is incredibly important to the broader strategic calculations of the United States in the Middle East, but also to the NATO transatlantic community, right? The one thing I want to leave you with, Pinar, is that whatever concerns exist, and there are concerns, okay? I can go through a list, and you know them already. You know them better than I. The purchase of the advanced Russian air defense system, right, the S-400. We kicking them out of the F-35 program, okay? But then things have got a whole lot better after they said, okay, the Swedes can go into NATO, and then we'll get some upgraded F-16s from the Americans, although they haven't received them yet. So the point is, there are concerns, okay? There are some issues between the two, but find me a single alliance or partnership where there aren't issues with them, right? I mean, we have issues with everybody, right? But the issue is, how do you manage them? And I think the claim that those issues have now become unmanageable and we need to completely reassess the relationship with Turkey is nonsense. And I think this president, for whatever reason, personally likes President Erdogan, right? And so on a very high level, when two leaders like each other, it's going to trickle down to, policy coordination, policy cooperation, and so on and so forth. So I think actually the relationship is on the ascendancy and not the other way around.
Bilal, thank you so much for your great insights. It was a great
Oh, it's my
interview.
pleasure, Pinar. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.